Well, hello, and welcome back to segment 2 of our podcast series that we're calling America Under Fire, The Old Guy Speaks. In segment 2, we're going to discuss the history of the U.S. dollar from 1792 to the present day. We've had a dollar since 1792, and it's been backed by gold and sometimes by silver for most of that time. Backed by gold means that you could exchange your paper dollars for gold at any bank. We'll talk about the dollar in part by talking about banking, beginning with our central bank. America has a central bank called the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve was established in 1913. It is not a federal agency, but is rather owned by the members of the central bank. Our central bank has 3 core duties. 1, to set interest rates. 2, to manage the money supply. And we'll come back and talk about that one, I think, a good bit. And 3, to regulate financial markets. The U.S. dollar has lost 99% of its value since 1913, which raises the question of whether the Federal Reserve was such a great idea to start with. Central banks can help, can be very useful, but our Fed has lost its way. Let's look at some milestones along the way. Our first milestone is an attack on the dollar made in April of 1933. President Franklin D. Roosevelt confiscated the gold that was privately owned in America and revalued it to $35 an ounce, assumedly to pay for his New Deal programs and for taking us out, drawing us out of the Depression. Gold went up 69% that day, from $20.67 an ounce to $35, and the dollar shrank accordingly. That's called inflation. But the dollar was still backed by gold at that time. The next milestone is a huge plus for the dollar. In July of 1944, just after D-Day, the World War II Allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and among other things, they formally declared the U.S. dollar to be the reserve currency of the world. The reserve currency is the currency used in international trade, and having the reserve currency makes for strong empires. More on that later. Next milestone was an attack on the dollar under President Johnson, who wanted to carry on the Vietnam War and also introduce the Great Society programs. He had a choice to make of guns or butter, and he made his choice. He chose both. Doing both created and brought us into deficit spending. Deficit spending means the government spending more than it takes in as income. Richard Nixon, who followed Lyndon Johnson, under Nixon, the U.S. deficit spending became so great that other countries decided they liked gold better than our paper dollars. So the pressure was on Richard Nixon to exchange the gold for dollars. In 1945, the U.S. held 60% of the world's official gold reserves. By 1971, that was down to 22%. Nixon then made what has been called the fatal attack on the dollar on August 15th of 1971, when he ended the dollar-gold link. the dollar became a fiat currency backed only by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. That day has been called by many as the day the dollar died. The dollar is now a fiat currency. It's not backed by gold or silver, and it allows uncontrolled deficit spending. You want to buy something? Just print more paper money. We do it now via computer strokes. You recall that the dollar has lost 99% of its value since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. 97% of that 99% drop in value has occurred since the 1971 end of the gold standard. A classic definition of inflation is more currency chasing the same or similar amount of goods and services. If a family making $60,000 a year spends $75,000 a year, when they've exhausted their savings, there will be consequences. It's the same for a nation. Those consequences do come, but much more slowly, especially when your reserve currency is the global reserve currency used in international trade. And we'll be discussing that more later. So, fiat money allows deficit spending by the government. Deficit spending ultimately brings misery and privation by way of inflation. Examples: Weimar Germany after World War I. Later examples: Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Argentina. In my wallet, I keep a Venezuelan 10 Bolivar note. At the turn of the century, January 1 of 2000, the Bolivar was worth about 65 cents US, making this 10 Bolivar note worth $6.50. By 2022, it took 40 million bolivars to equal $1 US. Hyperinflation, terrible, terrible inflation. What happened? Deficit spending. That may explain also why a lot of Venezuelans are walking to Panama to come further north. So, let's get down to it. Let's see how the U.S. is doing today on deficit spending. We have an official national debt here in the U.S. of 34 trillion and change. That is our national debt as reckoned by the U.S. government. That's our official debt. Our actual national debt is somewhere from 100 trillion to 200 trillion, based on various guesses by various experts. What's the difference between actual national debt and official? Unfunded obligations. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, pensions, and so on. That's how you get the difference. They are real obligations, but not shown in the official estimates. So how much is $1 trillion anyway? It sounds like a million, it sounds like a billion. They sound alike. How much difference is there? Can there be a whole lot of difference? Well, we'll take a look at that. Let's assume that you have unlimited access to fresh, crispy new U.S. $100 bills, Benjamins. How high a stack of Benjamins, fresh, crispy new U.S. $100 bills, how high a stack to make $1 million? Okay, confer among yourselves, make a guess. The answer is 43 inches, about the height of your kitchen countertop. So 43 inches for $1 million. You continue to have unlimited access to fresh, crispy new U.S. $100 bills. How high a stack of fresh, crispy new hundreds does it take to make $1 trillion? Place your bets, talk to your neighbor there. Let's see what happens. Okay, well, a billion is 1,000 million, and a trillion is 1,000 billion. So a trillion is a million million. That makes our 43-inch stack of Benjamins into a 43 million inch stack, which converts to 678.66 miles high. We'll call it 679 miles high. How does one even comprehend what 679 miles high looks like? Well, if you're on a cross-country commercial flight, you're somewhere around 6 or 7 miles high. So the $1 trillion stack is 100 times higher than you're flying in that commercial jet. Just amazing. But that's still incomprehensible. So let's try it again. The International Space Station orbits the Earth at an altitude of 250 miles. So if Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk could run you up to the International Space Station, you'd still be only 37% of the way to the top of the $1 trillion stack of Benjamins, which is 2.7 times the height or altitude of the International Space Station. One last try. Let's go on up to the Hubble Space Telescope. The Hubble Space Telescope orbits the Earth at an altitude of 340 miles. Well, you'd still be only 50% of the way to the top of that $1 trillion stack of Benjamins. So, a stack of Benjamins 43 inches high for $1 million versus a stack of Benjamins twice as high as the Hubble Space Telescope for $1 trillion. It is truly incomprehensible. Please listen to me. This is your wake-up call. $1 trillion is an incomprehensible amount of money. It rolls off the tongue so easily, doesn't it? Trillion, billion, million, gazillion. It's incomprehensible. Moving on. Our U.S. fiscal year 2023 official debt as a percentage of GDP, GDP being our gross domestic product, the sum total of the goods and services exchanged in the economy. Official debt as a percent of GDP, our debt is currently over 128% in that ratio. That's well into the danger zone, which starts at 90%. Our actual debt, not even worth looking at as a percent of GDP, that would be, using just the $100 trillion amount, that would be 381% times our GDP. More incomprehensibility. There's just a whole lot that's incomprehensible right now on this subject. But our official debt is at 128% of GDP. Hang on to that number, please. Squib. Since 1800, 51 out of 52 nations with gross government debt greater than 130% have defaulted either through restructuring, devaluation, high inflation, or outright default. A very, very painful process. On January 1, 2000, the turn of the century, the U.S. government owed only $5 trillion. We're now at $34 trillion plus, and there's been no intervening emergency like World War II. Let's talk about budget deficit. Our fiscal year 2023 U.S. federal budget deficit, our spending deficit, was $1.7 trillion in 1 year. That's just the deficit spending, the amount that we're spending over the amount that we're taking in as a government. And that deficit has hit $1 trillion for just the first half of fiscal 2024. So we're on track for a $2 trillion budget deficit. That's about $3.5 million a minute, or about $5 billion a day of deficit spending. And just the interest that we have to pay on that fast-growing debt is about to equal or exceed our total defense spending. What happens when the interest payments get prohibitively expensive? I think they're already there. If the government just prints more money to pay the interest, inflation just roars that much higher. I'd like to show you a graphic regarding our national debt. I'm going to put this up on the screen too. The graphic shows the time from the year 1900 to the present time. Our national debt was almost zero. This is the era when the dollar was covered by gold. Now, since we got rid of the gold, we're starting to trend up. And we've gotten so that we're going nearly vertical in terms of the national debt that we have to pay interest on. This one chart tells you the story. We're out of control. Right now it shows 2023. For 2023, it shows that $34 trillion in debt. And Congressional Budget Office projection shows us 10 years later at being up around $50 trillion. It's just unimaginable amounts of money. Just as we have official national debt and actual national debt, we have official inflation and actual inflation. After President Nixon's 1971 death blow to the US dollar, meaning taking it off the gold standard, deficit spending bloomed and, of course, brought more inflation. By 1983, official government computations were showing too much inflation. So the government began adopting methodologies that understate inflation to fudge the numbers so as to save on its payouts for welfare programs, salaries, and anything else that was indexed to inflation. And the manipulations to avoid reporting actual inflation seem to have just gotten worse over the years. One illustration of phony government inflation reporting is the Ford F-150 index. The F-150 sold for $1,279 in 1948, its first year out. And the 2024 base model stickered at $38,565, 30.2 times the 1948 price. But the official government inflation measuring of that same time frame would have had the 2024 F-150 selling for $16,500. So there's the government yardstick and the real world yardstick. and ne'er the train shall meet. I recently saw a graphic showing fast food prices in the 10-year period since 2014. While inflation shows on the chart as 31%, that would almost certainly be official inflation, by the way. Fast food inflation ran on that 10-year chart from 39% to 100% over that 10 years for the various fast food chains. There's one other gauge that relates inflation to the minimum wage, the Big Mac minimum wage ratio, which shows that on January 1, 2000, a minimum wage worker had to work 26 minutes to pay for a Big Mac. And by February 2024, it was 47 minutes. That's up 80%. Squib. Just since the COVID outbreak in 2020, U.S. home prices are up 47%. I think that's a Federal Reserve number. And used cars are up 40%. Squib. The average person can no longer afford the average house. That's a quote from somewhere. Squib. To buy a house took 4 years' pay in 1971 and takes 8 years' pay now. Squib. Here are some price changes from the year 2000 to the year 2023. 23-year span. Postage stamp, 33 cents to 66 cents. New car, $24,750 to $48,000 plus. Gallon of gas, $1.26 to $3.54. A lot of inflation. End of squib. Okay, to review just a bit. Before 1971, the dollar was worth X ounces of gold. It was backed by gold. You could exchange it for gold. From 1971 to the present, the dollar has been a fiat currency, a piece of paper backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. Even former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan once admitted that all fiat currencies fail, and ours is failing, albeit gradually at present. We have a deficit spending problem. I don't recall either Trump or Biden saying the words balanced budget in any of their campaign rhetoric. We have passed a tipping point on our currency, and I believe that we must go through a deep valley of sorts to get back to the fiscal sunlight. It's actually more of an ethical or moral problem, as are many or most of the issues that we're facing today. And I'll have more on that later. Overall, it would seem that truth is the first victim in this, and that is a goal of Marxism, the death of truth. Squib, Lenin, not John Lennon, Vladimir Lenin of Soviet communist fame. Lenin predicted that America would collapse by spending itself to death. He may be right. But hope abides. It does abide, and I do pledge to cover that later. So this includes our segment 2. I thank you for watching. Please come back shortly for segment 3, which will be the proposed future of the U.S. dollar. Thank you.